We are very glad that you are here to join us for mastering the SAT and ACT. Let me introduce myself. My name is Missy Fox. I've been a homeschool mom for the last 2 decades, and we recently graduated our 4th and final child in May. In the meantime, since then, I've enjoyed working with high schoolers and their families through what can often be a very stressful time, but a really exciting time at the end of high school when people are considering what comes next. We found that time exciting because it was a time that we had to lean more heavily on the Lord than we had in the past. And we also got to see him work, sometimes in near miraculous ways. So I like being part of this. That's why we set this up, to see if we could pass along some of the tips that we have learned on SAT and ACT prep. And I'd also like to introduce my daughter, Sarah Fox.
And I'm Sarah, and I am a student at Patrick Henry College, and I am a survivor of the SAT and ACT prep. So yeah, I'm excited to share what I've learned.
Okay. So we are going to, our goal today is to help you find the most effective and efficient way to increase your scores on the SAT or the ACT. So we're going to talk first about the need, why it is valuable to score highly on these tests, and then talk about a method for how to get there and how to do well on them. After we go through that process with you, we'll have a time for questions. And if we have any leftover time, we'll go on with some more tips on specific sections with what time we have left. This method that we've used with our kids that we're going to be sharing, we have been able to see increases in scores of up to 350 points for them and their friends and other people we've worked with on the SAT, and then 6 or 7 points in the ACT. So hopefully this will be helpful to you as well. So let's start out with the need. Why would you invest your time working on the SAT or ACT? Well, let me tell you a story. This is Meg. I want to introduce you to Meg. She is a junior in high school. She is considering a few different options for school, but there's one particular school she has her eye on. Unfortunately, this school costs $38,000 a year, which is a problem for her. See, she and her parents have put together some savings, a little bit, not as much as they might have wanted. The school thankfully has given her some scholarships, and she's earned some outside scholarships. And she knows there's a $2,500 a year federal education tax credit that's available for almost all Americans. And she did think about it. She can work a campus job. She figures she can earn a couple thousand a year doing that if she works maybe 10 hours a week. And then in the summer, she figures she can make $2,500 in the summer if she's lucky. But unfortunately, that still leaves a deficit of $6,000 a year. So what shall she do? There is a cheaper school she could go to, but it doesn't really seem like the best fit for her. She could apply for more outside scholarships, but those can be hard to come by, and they usually are more like $1,000 one time. It's more typical, not usually $6,000 a year. She could do what her friends would do, which is to put it all on a loan. That would be $24,000. But you know, the average college student in the US is $38,000 in debt at the end of school, so maybe that wouldn't be unusual. But Meg has thought about it. She really doesn't want to go there with the loan because she knows that someday she wants to be home with her kids, and she's afraid if she has a big debt, it would force her into the workplace and force her kids into daycare, which is a non-starter for her. So how about a campus job? She was already planning on working about 10 hours a week. What if she increased that number? Well, she ran the math. If she makes $10 an hour and she subtracts off tax and tithe, and then figures out how many weeks there are that she could be working during the academic year, to make $6,000, she would have to work an additional 29 hours a week. Well, that is not going to work for a full-time college student. But thankfully, there is one more option left. This particular school she likes has an academic scholarship, which is based on test scores. Now, right now, Meg is at 1,300 on the SAT, which is pretty good. But if she can raise that to a 1,500, she will guaranteed get another $6,000 a year from this school. So she's thinking another 29 hours a week at a campus job, or I raise my SAT score 200 points. She is motivated to do some test prep here.
So I guess a lot of you are like Meg, and you have a good reason to want to raise your test scores. The question is, what scores do you need? So a lot of schools after COVID have released their requirement of people having test scores for admission, but 20% of colleges do still require these standardized test scores in order to be admitted to the schools. So 20% of schools require them, but even if a school doesn't require them, it's still recommended to get good test scores and have those on hand for merit and academic scholarships. And even if they don't require them for those, it's often important for them to have them on hand just to see one more thing in your favor. Specifically for homeschoolers, it's also important as an outside verification, essentially, that it's not just mommy grades you got in high school, but you did actually learn something. So the question is, how do you know what score you actually need to get on the test? Well, here we have some nationally just statistics of what nationally students get on the SAT and ACT. So if you look there at the 50th percentile, the average student gets a 1060 on the SAT and a 20 on the ACT. So that means if you just look down the column to the 90th percentile, that means if you score a 1320, you're scoring better than 90% of the kids taking the test. So the real question is, for the school you're interested in, what score do you need to get? Well, here we have an example of NC State and for Princeton. So for NC State, a good rule of thumb for just getting admitted to a school is to aim for the 75th percentile for that school's students, their average scores. So that means for NC State, the 75th percentile would be getting a 1410 on the SAT or a 32 on the ACT. So if you're looking at NC State, that's a good marker to aim for. But if you're looking at Princeton, the 75th percentile would be 1570 or a 35 for the ACT. So if you want to know these numbers for the school you're interested in, just Google that school and their test scores or their average test scores of their students, and you should find the same type of information. So that's just talking about acceptance into a school. So what about their merit scholarships? So there are usually merit scholarship cutoffs, and we have listed here 3 schools. Covenant, PHC, and Cedarville are all small Christian schools. Covenant is in Georgia, PHC is in Virginia, and Cedarville is in Ohio. So for Covenant, their top merit scholarship has a 1320 minimum requirement for your test scores for the SAT or 28 for the ACT. This does mean if you have exactly a 1320, you won't necessarily get the scholarship, but you can still apply for it. So of course, it's always better to have higher than that. PHC, for their top academic scholarship, you have to have at least a 1500 or a 34 to qualify for that. In Cedarville, for their top academic scholarship, you have to have a 1520 to apply, as well as a 4.0. So these are all examples of just the top scholarship where you might need to be in that range. And again, if you want to find the information for other schools you might be interested in, just Google those schools and their academic scholarships, and they'll list that kind of information on their website as well.
Okay, great. So now that you have some idea of what score you need, the question is, how do you get there? So we're going to go through this in 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about some universally applicable tips and tricks that help everybody. And then we're going to hone in on how to figure out what your personal weaknesses are and how to best address them. And then, because this is a lot of work doing test prep, some strategies for perseverance, how to stay motivated as you're completing this process of studying. So first, some tips for everyone. The most important first thing to think about is which test should you be taking. The ACT and the SAT are both accepted by all colleges. In fact, there's a 3rd test, the CLT, the Classical Learning Test, which has just started in recent years. It's accepted by a lot of Christian schools, and that would be a great one to use as well if you're going to a Christian school. I would recommend that you consider also prepping either the ACT or SAT, though, if you want to do the CLT, just because if you think you're only going to a school that would be accepting the CLT, things can always change. That happens frequently senior year. You never know if suddenly someone has a health issue and you want to live at home and go to NC State or something. You don't want to shoot yourself in the foot by closing doors too early. So I think it's valuable to prep as well for either the ACT or SAT. Now, picking the right test is really important because it is very likely you will do significantly better on one than another. This was true for Meg. When she switched from the SAT to the ACT, her score went up significantly. In fact, it went up a whole scholarship bracket, which was worth $3,000 a year to her. So picking the right test can be very beneficial to you. So let's look at some comparisons between SAT and ACT. SAT is 2 major sections, a verbal section and a math section. ACT has 4 sections plus an optional essay. The SAT used to have an optional essay, but they've dropped that now. You can see the score range. The SAT, they just add together up to 800 and up to 800 to get 1600. The ACT averages your 4 sections. If you want to take these tests to fulfill your North Carolina annual standardized testing requirement, you can, but you have to use the ACT with the essay. That's the only one available. When the SAT had an essay, you could use that, but you can't anymore. To sign up, you just go to these websites, make an account, pick a date that you want to take the test, and they will pop up a list of schools that are near you, public schools and private schools, and you can pick the one you want to go to and pay the money and you're signed up. Do sign up early if you can, especially now with COVID when they're limiting seating. A lot of these schools will fill up pretty early. So if you wait till the last day of the deadline, you may end up having to drive an hour away to find an available seat. Now, probably the most significant difference for a lot of people is you'll see the ACT has a lot more questions in actually less time than the SAT does. So you're getting less time per question on the ACT. So Green Test Prep puts it very well when they say, if you are awesome at fast-paced assignments and you can stay focused for long periods of time, you have a huge competitive edge on the ACT. Now, the reason for that is that these tests are graded on a curve. So if you tend to be faster than most people plowing through testing, then you're going to be on the upper end of that ACT curve. If, however, you prefer to take your time and think things through, or if you usually don't finish your tests on time in school, the ACT will be a total nightmare. And we very much found this to be true in our family. Our firstborn child, like a typical firstborn, is very perfectionistic and meticulous. And her method of reading would be to read a paragraph and then think, oh, I think I may have skipped a word. I will read it again and go back and read through. So she got through reading sections very slowly and did far better on the SAT than she did on the ACT. On the other hand, she had a sister who ended up being a literature major, loved to read, could read very quickly, and the ACT was a better test for her. Another one of our kids was a debater, was used to looking at a lot of websites to try to find debate evidence and skimming through a lot of very long articles. And that skimming ability made it so that the ACT was a preferable test for her, as it turned out. Okay, math is another slight difference between the tests. You can see it counts for 50% on the SAT and only 25% on the ACT, which if you hate math might be important to you. The ACT has more of an emphasis on geometry, something like 30% of the questions are geometry, much less on the SAT. SAT has more data analysis, statistics, scatter plots, that sort of thing. ACT has more, it has logarithms and a little bit more in trig graphing. So a few differences there. So if you still aren't sure, you're looking at this and saying, I just don't know, the thing to do is to take 2 practice tests, one for each. Go to the actual website, SAT and ACT, find one of their downloadable practice tests and sit down one day, take 3.5 hours and take one of them, wait 2 days or a day and take the other one, and just compare your scores. And by then you should have a pretty good sense of which test is better for you.
Right, so the first universal tip for everyone is to choose the right test. But the second one is to answer every question. So they tell you this at the beginning of the tests every time, but it is really important to listen to it. There is no penalty for guessing on the test. So that means they won't take off extra credit for you filling in an answer you aren't actually sure on. So that means if you're getting near the end of the section and you don't have enough time to answer a bunch of questions, just fill in a bunch of bubbles and just guess on them. So I would always choose C. I would always fill in the bubbles for C if I didn't have enough time and had extra problems left. So even if you're just doing that, it still gives you a chance of getting them right as well. The next tip for everyone is to write in the book. So they give you a bubble sheet and they also give you the actual questions in a booklet. So that is the booklet that you should be covering in notes. You should be marking questions, whether or not you're sure on things. You should be underlining things, starring things. This just helps you get all of your brain thought onto the paper so you don't make a logical mistake in your head when you're just trying to do everything in your head and keep everything there. So that's very helpful to actually put everything down on the paper. The next one is to take it 3 or more times. We started in our family when we were in 7th grade, so that meant by the time it actually started to matter for me and I was getting to the point where my grade could actually be good, it wasn't as stressful for me to go into the whole process because I had gotten really used to how everything felt. We also played around with this for super scoring. So a lot of schools will do super scoring, which basically means that they'll take your best scores from each section or from your best testing date. So depending on the school, for example, PHC where I am, they'll super score the SAT. So they'll take your best math section and combine that with your best English section. But they don't do the same super scoring system for the ACT. They just take whichever test date you score the best and they'll just consider that one. A lot of schools though do super score for all of the tests. So just look into that as well. So again, just familiarity, getting yourself used to taking the test a lot will relieve a lot of stress the day of. The next tip is to bubble in bunches. So this means that if you finish question number 4 on the math section and you know the answer is C, don't immediately go over to your test booklet and fill in the bubble then. Instead, wait till you've done about 10 questions or 15 questions at a time, and then go in and bubble everything in a bunch. This means if you save about 1 second per question on going back and forth bubbling things, then over the totality of the test, you will have saved about 4 minutes. So it actually is really significant by the end. So this saves time, but it also helps if you get one question off. So if you weren't sure on question 12 and you left it blank, and then when you filled in question 13, you accidentally put it in 12's spot, and then you realized back at question 32, you would have to go erase everything. So bubbling in bunches, again, just helps you stay on track for which question you're actually filling it in for. All right, so the next tip is to adjust your watch. So this means to put the minute hand where it will finish up by the end of that section at the 12-minute mark. So if there's a 40-minute section, instead of just looking at the time and knowing, okay, I have to go till about 9:13 and then trying to read the clock properly for that, just set your minute hand to 20 minutes so that it'll be at 12 by the time that that section should be done. This is really helpful just to look down quickly and know how much time you have left without having to do even more math calculations in the middle. All right, the next one is to make friends with your calculator. I actually, at the advice of my tutor, did about 3 to 4 hours of YouTube videos watching how to do all of the functions on my calculator when I was doing test prep. It may seem stupid to spend time just messing around on your calculator, but it actually is really helpful to make you feel more comfortable with the calculator you're using, to help you know how to do all the different functions you might need. There were even some functions that I could still do on my calculator that was allowed by the SAT and ACT that made a lot of questions easier. So definitely make friends with your calculator. It's kind of a fun break from studying, and it's helpful the day of. All right, so there's some more websites that have some good tips for everyone. College Prep Genius has a video course that's about 12 hours long. They have a lot of weird acronyms to remember things that you don't necessarily need to know the acronym, but they have a lot of really helpful tips within that. So that's definitely recommended. Additionally, Prep Scholar and greentestprep.com have very helpful articles about specific ways to target different sections on the tests and things like different formulas that are important to know for math and things like that. Additionally, getting a tutor can be extremely helpful in giving you ideas on how to get better in specific areas, as well as the test as a whole, or some areas you might struggle with individually.
Okay, so those were some universally applicable tips that help everybody. So now let's talk about how to figure out a personalized strategy for growth. So those tips and tricks that help everybody can increase your scores some, but if you want to see significant shifts in your scores, like 5 points for the ACT, 200 points for the SAT, you've got to figure out your own weaknesses. You need to do some effective self-diagnosis. Where is it you're struggling? Is it you're not finishing the test on time? Are you making sloppy adding errors in the math section? Do you just not know enough trig? Do you have trouble reading graphs? You've got to figure this out by practicing, doing practice tests. In fact, practice tests will do 3 things for you. First, they will highlight your patterns of weakness, which is what you want. Second, they give you an opportunity to become consistent in implementing the different tips and tricks that you've learned. And third, they just give you general familiarity with the test. you will find after you have done, a half dozen practice tests, you become so familiar with the way these things are written that okay, here we come. We're going to have, 2 arguing scientists next. And we're about time for one of those problems with a ladder leaning against the wall, and I've got to find the sign. It's just the same kinds of things over and over again. Our oldest told us once that somebody gave her a practice test that was out of a different review book, like Princeton Review, and she could immediately tell this is not a legitimate SAT test because she was so used to the content. And that really helps you in doing well on it. So you're busy. So how can we get you scores of 350 points more on the SAT or 6 or 7 points more on the ACT? Well, here is the method that we have used that we really like.
The first tip is to simulate the actual test whenever you are taking a practice test. As much as you can simulate the real environment you're going to be in on test day, the more it'll build those neural pathways and help you get used to the real thing for test day. So the first way to do that is by using the real tests. So there's a lot of companies out there like Princeton Review or Kaplan that have options of practice tests you can take, but these are not the real tests that have been used in the past. So instead, use the tests from College Board for SAT or from the ACT company for the ACT. You can get these either in an actual book form, and we have the pictures of those on the screen, or you can find on websites like Prep Scholar the actual PDFs of those real tests from the SAT and the ACT. So once you take the actual tests that will be used, it'll help you recognize the kinds of problems that they do use on the real thing. So next, use actual paper when you're taking the test. So if you've gotten one of those hard copy books, write in that again to practice what it's like writing in the actual textbook, as well as if you have the online copy, just make sure you print off the PDF so you can have it on paper. Next, practice the timing. This includes the breaks. So if there's a 5-minute break in between 2 sections, actually take that when you're practicing at home. Additionally, when you're taking the break, don't pull out your phone, don't do things you wouldn't be allowed to do in the actual testing environment, and do practice moving around, doing things that will keep your blood flowing like you would on the actual test date. With your calculator, again, use the actual one you're going to use in the test on the test day. There is a theme here. Don't use your phone, use what you'll actually be using. And this helps you, again, get used to the calculator, familiarize yourself with it, and just have the feeling of not being with your phone during the test. Next is the environment. A lot of you may have very noisy siblings or dogs or construction workers, etc. So make sure that your family knows that you're taking a practice test, that your parents know your mom won't make you try and empty groceries, things like that, so that you can stay as focused as you possibly can. Additionally, turn off your phone so you don't have notifications distracting you and things like that. Next one you may not like, but lots of places, if not all, are going to require masks on test date if you're taking it in the near future. So what I recommend is actually practicing the practice tests at home, yes, while wearing a mask. I realized this was very helpful after I practiced this at home with one of the masks I had, and I realized that it made my face so warm that I felt like I was going to fall asleep during the test. So then I tried switching for the next practice test that I took at home to a different kind of mask, and that was better. So that was just a nice way of getting me used to, again, what it would feel like in the actual environment. So again, all of these things are just helping your neural pathways grow in the right way where you feel the most comfortable and confident you can going into the time of the test. All right, so mark your guesses. This goes along with the whole theme of using real paper, of writing in your book. I would always use a system where I'd put a star by something that I was completely unsure of, that I was really guessing on, or I put a little squiggle on something that I was pretty confident on, but might want to go back and check if I had extra time after filling out the questions. So whatever system you use, just mark your questions up so that you know if you finish a section early and you have time to go back and check things, you know which questions to start with. Additionally, if you're going to review those questions later, you'll know which ones to go back and review if you're just doing it for practice. All right,
Okay,
so
there is a special way to correct your test as well. First of all, when you're taking a practice test, if there are questions that you don't get to, go ahead and draw a line where you are able to finish within the time, and then complete the rest of the test, because you don't want to lose that opportunity to learn from those last few questions. So complete the test. When you get a score, you can score it with and without those extra questions just to see what it would have been. And then when you go through the answer key, a very important point is do not write down the correct answer. So if you put B and the answer was A, don't write down A, just make an X to show that it was wrong. The rationale for that is once you are done correcting the test, and by now we're probably on the next day because this is, another batch of work that you're doing. You're going to go back and each of the questions you got wrong and each of the questions you had to guess on, you're going to try again and give it a good serious try. You let yourself struggle for 10 minutes with it rather than just going right to the solutions manual and seeing what the answer was and where it came from. The rationale for this is when you put in that effort to figure it out yourself, what went wrong and how to find the right answer, it's going to emblazon it in your mind where you will remember it far more thoroughly than if you just go and read the answer in the solutions manual. But once you've given it a good go and you've really tried, if there's things that you still haven't been able to figure out, then at that point you do go to the solutions manual so you can understand what went wrong.
All right, so important is to keep a notebook. And in the notebook, every time you review a question, you want to write down what the question was about and why specifically you got it wrong. This will help you figure out where your trouble spots are. So for me, if there was a vocab word I didn't know and that's why I got a reading question wrong, then I would write down, I didn't know this vocab word, and write down the definition so I would know for the future. Or if there's a certain rule of grammar you don't know, or a formula for math, or you have problems reading topic sentences too quickly and having trouble recognizing what the most important part of a paragraph is. So whatever it is, write down the why of your mistakes. And additionally, for math problems specifically, write down on a stack of flashcards every math problem that you get wrong so that you can go back and review those questions and try them over again later. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we go more towards the math section. So once you have taken your notebook, you can identify specific weak areas that you have or recurring problems that you're focusing on and then study those specifically. So a good way to study those specifically is some different study tools online. So the first would be Khan Academy. Is really helpful for English as well as for math. It really helps to dive into specific areas for math. And they even have some English practice for SAT specifically. But once you know if you have problems with one trigonometric function, you can go and practice those specifically on Khan Academy and kind of work through those issue spots. Another one you can use is UWorld, which is kind of the same type of thing as Khan Academy, just another way to target specific areas. And last of all, you can use coaching. So this is really helpful, especially if you hit that road bump and you don't know how to get past it or how to do something quickly. Find somebody who's an expert in it or who's done a lot of test prep, just somebody who can help out and supplement some of your work that you're doing by yourself. One that I found very helpful was the GRE book. Yes, it is actually 5 pounds like it says, so it is large, but you don't even need to study all of the sections in order to have a really good grasp of the math. So this is specifically for people who are scoring pretty well on the math section of the SAT or ACT, but want to get it that last little bit. This will help with the more difficult questions, getting used to doing those quickly, and especially will help with the speed. So the GRE is harder than the SAT and ACT, but practicing those questions, practicing things that might be more difficult will make you more comfortable with the SAT type of questions. So that helps with timing and with reliability of your answers.
And one extra comment on that, the GRE is put out by the same people as the SAT. So there is a certain similarity in the approach, even if it is a little more challenging.
Yeah. So a good system of going through and practicing specific problem areas that you might have is to take 10 questions from either SAT or ACT section and practice them daily. So this is especially, again, helpful for students who are already scoring well on the math section but want to get it higher. So starting on Monday as an example, you would pick 10 questions and take 2 copies of the questions. So print off 2 copies of those questions. With one of the copies, you go ahead and take it in time conditions, so 9 minutes or 11 minutes for ACT versus SAT respectively. So take it in the timed conditions And then you're done with that, move on to Khan Academy, whatever problem area you've been working on. And then after you finish whatever review you've been doing on Khan Academy or UWorld, then go back to the questions that you took and just correct them. Just see how many you got wrong and see why you got those things wrong. From there, you can make flashcards out of all of the math questions that you got wrong and write down, for this, you would have written down in your notebook why you got it wrong, but specifically for the flashcard part of it, just write down the actual question on the flashcard and what the right answer is on the back. So then you can review flashcards that you've made previously, but don't review the questions that you just already went through that day. So then when we get to Tuesday, that second copy of the 10 questions that you made is going to come in useful. But first, take 10 new problems, make 2 copies of that, take the 10 new problems, do everything like you did Monday, work on Khan Academy, and then come back. And with the second copy you made on Monday of Monday's questions, take Monday's questions back over again. So the point of this is to see, because you studied them Monday, because you studied why you got them wrong, if Tuesday you'll remember how to do those questions better. And again, do them in the time limits and everything, and then just review your flashcards. So that kind of system keeps going over and over again so that you're taking the same kinds of questions over and over again, but it's helping you get more and more used to solving them properly and solving them faster.
Sarah, what does that do for you to be reviewing the same things over and over again, as opposed to just cramming and then moving on with a new batch?
Yeah, so if you cram information, as I'm sure a lot of people have realized during finals, and I have realized the hard way, is you won't retain the information for a long time. If you just memorize all the information in one point, it's going to drop off quickly. So you want to practice what's called spaced repetition. So you study, 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 but then you want to keep studying consistently. So like daily, study the same thing over and over again. And then eventually, once you've studied it for a while, you can start spacing it more and still have the repetition. So maybe start doing it every 2 days, doing those flashcards every 2 days. Once you feel like you've got the hang of it, move to 3 days. And eventually you can practice it once a week or once a month and you'll still remember it. So there's statistics of people doing this with foreign languages and things like that. If they just cram a bunch of information, they might know it really well one time, but then they'll forget it. But if people do spaced repetition, then they'll remember it years to come, even if they haven't actually studied the vocab words or something in another language for a long time.
So this kind of SAT and ACT prep could actually benefit you 4 years later when you're applying for grad school and have to take the GRE.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, good. One more question. When you make a flashcard, are you writing the 4 or 5 answer choices on the front of the flashcard, or are you just writing down the problem and expecting yourself to come up with the answer?
I would usually put the answer options on there since you're going to have those for the SAT or ACT. I know there are a couple free response questions for the SAT, so that's where you would not put down the answer options because you don't have them. But you would put down the answer options because sometimes, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but sometimes you could plug in answers and things like that to find the answer. So with that kind of thing, it's actually helpful to know what your answer options would be on the test.
Good. Okay, so after you have done all this work, again, you would put any helpful notes you learned, any formulas, any tips, any insights you had, you would record those in the notebook as well. And then the last step is make sure you study that notebook before you actually go back to take another practice test. You want to flip through it, read through, remind yourself of the insights that you'd had. So that is the cycle. You simulate the actual test environment to the best of your ability, take the test, correct the test, and redo problems you got wrong or guessed on. And then you study the solutions, record the reasons for your mistakes in a notebook and analyze them to try to figure out your weaknesses, look for patterns, and then study those areas of weaknesses so you don't make the same mistakes again. And then you go back and do another test. So you are probably thinking to yourself, this sounds like a lot of work. And it's true, because each test is 3.5 hours long, including the breaks. Then you've got analysis and review of concepts. And we would recommend you try to do at least 10 tests in this manner, plus studying your weak areas. So in our experience, that usually takes between 50 and 150 hours of work. And I know what you're thinking now. You're thinking, I have a really busy year. There's no way I can squeeze in 50 to 150 hours of test prep on top of what I'm currently doing. So it's true. This is going to be a balancing situation where you're going to have to look at different things in your life and see where something can be sacrificed to make space for test prep. Now, we don't want to destroy your last year or two at home, because there's a lot of things that are really special that happen at the end of high school. For one thing, it's your last full-time, all-year experience living with your family for a lot of people. And you're going to want to be spending time with your siblings and your parents and your high school friends. There are a lot of extracurricular activities that are hitting a peak at this point in high school, whether it's you want to get to nationals in speech and debate, or you're doing some kind of sports team, and this is a really important year for the team. And we're not saying that those things need to go. Even many of you are doing ministries that are very important and not worth sacrificing. So this is difficult. This is going to require you getting down on your knees and praying and considering things soberly and asking the Lord what he would want you to do in arranging your schedule. So part of that is to analyze what your time is actually worth. So let's go back and talk about Meg again. Remember, Meg figured out that for every 100 points on the SAT that she could get up at her school, that was worth $3,000 a year. So let's say it's going to take Meg 75 hours to achieve that 100-point increase, which is fairly reasonable. She's a junior. So over the course of the academic year, if you ignore breaks, it would take her about 3 hours a week for a 25-week period. Now, if she doesn't manage to increase that score and has to get the $12,000 through a campus job, she has to work 14.5 hours a week for 4 years. So she's going to look and weigh this situation. She can give up 3 hours a week now for 1 year in high school, or she'll be looking at giving up 14.5 hours a week for 4 years in college. So yeah, you may have to let some things go now, but understand that if you don't, it may mean you have to let a lot more go later. So Meg in this situation chose test prep. Here's another way to look at it. If 75 hours of work can earn you $12,000, that means you're getting paid $193 an hour for every hour you put into test prep. That pay rate is equivalent to $400,000 a year, which is pretty crazy good money for a high schooler. In fact, that's more money than you may be earning at any point for the rest of your life. You see, you've got this unique window right now in high school that if you invest now, you can get a wonderful payback. So the question really is, what in your life are you doing right now that you're willing to give up for $193 an hour? If you were going to sit down and play a video game for an hour and I offered you $193 not to play it, what would you do? So think through your life that way. And you may find things that you're willing to do more efficiently or reorganize. Maybe there's even a part-time job where you're making minimum wage that it would make sense to drop that job for a while or cut back on your hours. So let's talk now. Let's say you're motivated. We need to talk about some strategies for perseverance. How do you stay motivated to pull this off?
The first and most important one is to pray. Ultimately, pray for God's direction and his will, because if he wants you at certain schools and you have to have high test scores for that, he'll make that happen, or vice versa. If for some reason he doesn't want you to have the scores that you're looking for, ultimately he's still sovereign in that. So just pray for his guidance and pray for the whole process, because ultimately this is a lot of work and we can't do it without his guidance. The next is to build accountability. So having a good accountability structure will keep you motivated to do all of this hard work and get the good rewards from it. So there's a couple ways to build this accountability. The first is through scheduling. Scheduling consequences and rewards is very helpful to keep the ball rolling with the studying. So consider creating these yourself and think through things that you want to motivate yourself with or have consequences for. For example, you could tell your mom to take away your phone if you haven't done X amount of ACT prep by 5 p.m. or things like that. That will keep you motivated. The next one is to have prep groups. This can be a lot nicer than studying by yourself. So we did this once in the summer. We had a prep group where we had about 6 to 8 friends come over, and we just went through practice tests. We discussed them amongst ourselves. We had snacks in the middle, which was great. And So it was a really fun time, but we also got a lot done. The two cautions with this is, first of all, make sure that the people in the group all are around the same kind of scoring range. This will ensure that you don't have people who are at an 1100 working with people who are at a 1500 or something like that. That will make it difficult to help each other to the best of your ability. So make sure people are in the same kind of range. And secondly, it would be really helpful to have somebody else there, like a parent or a coach, who could help out with questions you might have. And both of those, again, will just help the accountability of the group.
And a last method of did I skip something, Sarah?
No.
Okay. Last method that you may consider using is using a tutor. We have done this before when we felt like it was going to be particularly helpful. The advantage of a tutor is you have an outside person that the student is having to go to once or twice a week. They know they're going to meet with this tutor, so it's motivating to get your homework done when there's somebody outside of the family, outside of yourself. We used James Lanier at Wyzant. He was wonderful. He charges $100 an hour. Another option, shameless plug, Sarah does do tutoring. She tutors on Wyzant for $45 an hour, but she can tutor off the Wyzant platform for $30 because then Wyzant doesn't take a cut. You can see she's got a lot of teaching background. You can read her bio on our website. And that does lead us to, in case you hadn't figured it out yet, Meg is Sarah in our story. By God's grace, she did manage to increase her test scores to the amount she needed to get to that scholarship bracket and go to her first choice school, which is Patrick Henry, which she loves. So we are very grateful that the Lord worked that out for her. So Sarah, how was that whole test prep process for you, looking back on it?
Yeah, so I'm not going to lie, it was a lot of work, and it was daunting at the beginning of hearing all of the information about how much I knew that it was potential to earn, but still how much work it would be. But in the long run, having those accountability systems in place and everything really helped me get through it. And there got to be a point where it was very strangely kind of enjoyable, especially with the math section. My mom can tell you that I have not enjoyed math for pretty much my entire life, but after going through these systems of just practicing questions, practicing flashcards, doing things over and over again, it actually became kind of like a game to me. So it was daunting to begin with. It was difficult, but it ended up being really rewarding in the long run. And even in the short run, while I was doing it, it got to the point where it was kind of fun and pretty satisfying once I knew how to crank out the answers quickly. One random thing that I did that helped with that was I knew I enjoyed using a whiteboard, so I would use a whiteboard for a lot of my questions when I was just cranking through practice problems, and that made it feel more like a game to me. So little things like that, if you know you enjoy, just stick those in the process, and it'll, again, help make it more rewarding.
There is something, Sarah, isn't there, satisfying when you've learned ways that the SAT or ACT tries to catch you, and you hit a problem and you're like, aha, you're trying to do that to me, and I know that trick, and you're not going to pull that one over me. You kind of conquer the test.
Yeah, exactly. And there's even a way to kind of channel the hard work into satisfaction of feeling like I've put in a lot of work on this, and when you know those tricks, how to get around them, that makes it kind of fun. And even on test day, then there were times where I would go into the test, and because I had done it so many times, it became second nature to go through the whole process. Then it was satisfying, especially on test day, to be like, I know what I'm doing here. It's like a game. I can figure this out.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, that brings us on to our point of questions. Are there any questions that any of you have that we could share? And I think we're going to go ahead and turn the recording off for this point. Okay, well, we've got a little bit of time left, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about some tips for particular sections for a couple minutes here. Let's start with the science section.
All right, so the science section is one that can be intimidating because there's a lot of words that most of us don't really know unless we are scientists or looking to go into STEM. So it can be very scary at first, but the nice thing is that it doesn't have to be. So we have an example problem here, and as you can see, the first whole paragraph is just a bunch of information about how they're doing the experiment, a bunch of information about ammonia and things like that. But the trick is, once you get to the actual question, you don't need to have read all of that information. All you really need to do in the science section is to know how to look at a graph, to read the axes, and know what it's saying. That's really all you need to know. There are an exception of a couple questions that do point back to the paragraphs, but we'll talk about those in a second. So all you need to do for this question is look first at the graph. So the graph has a bunch of numbers here that are the number of cycles. So it's important to first read the axes. So we have number of cycles and then temperature starting at 300 Celsius. So once you understand the graph, then you can go straight into the questions. So we have the question, in experiment 1, 26 cycles were needed to complete the reaction at 450 Celsius, when which catalyst was used. So the numbers are telling us 26 cycles and 450 degrees Celsius. So let's go ahead and find 26 cycles on our chart. So we already looked at the axes so that we know which one is going to be on, and there we've got it marked. All right, then let's look at the temperature. So 450 degrees Celsius. There we go. So our intersection is at the little triangle. And if we look to the key, we know that the triangle is catalyst X. So our answer is G, catalyst X. So all that took was knowing how to read a graph and being able to read the question. It was super easy if you have a basic understanding of how to read a graph. And going back to the confusing information that they first gave you in the paragraph where they tried to scare you into not doing the questions, you didn't actually need any of that information. So like I said, there are a couple exceptions. Sometimes they will ask about things in that paragraph. Sometimes they'll want a specific piece of information, but when they do that, there'll be some kind of keyword, like they want you to talk about the formula for ammonia or something that you'll know where to look in the paragraph now that you kind of know what to look for from the question itself. There are sometimes, there's usually about one passage in the ACT that's just a bunch of different scientists' opinions on a certain issue, and so there'll be like 6 short little paragraph passages. So those you do have to read because it's pretty much just comparing and contrasting those. But other than that, the vast majority of the science questions, you only need to know how to read a graph.
Okay, great. Well, let's jump over to, if I can get my screen to move. Why won't my screen not move? This is awkward. Okay, let's jump over to math. Try a problem there. So one of the beautiful things about taking SAT or ACT, math is, except for one small section on the SAT, all of the answers are given to you there in multiple choice. So use the answers. Often that's a lot faster than actually solving the problem. So take this problem. I could start this by squaring both sides to get rid of the square root mark, and then subtracting things and adding things, trying to make an equation, maybe factoring it or completing the square and finding the 2 roots. And that gives me a lot of opportunities to make a mistake in a sign or an addition or whatever. Here's a different way. I look at the answers and I notice, well, this is interesting. Whoops. I have to annotate first. I see 3s and I see 6s repeated. I wonder if the answer is either a 3 or a 6. So I'm like, I'm going to try the 3. I like small numbers. So square root of 3 minus, okay, they tell me that a is 2 equals 3 minus 4. Well, that's the square root of 1 equals -1. Well, I know that's not true. So 3 can't be the correct answer. So I can get rid of 3. Oh, and you know what that means? I can also get rid of choice A because that's the set that includes 3 and 6. So that's not right either. Well, now I'm down to a 50% shot on this problem, and it's barely taken me any time at all. So let's try the 6. We saw there were 3s and 6s. So 6 minus 2, square root equals 6 minus 4, square root of 4 equals 2. Hey, that works. Okay, there's my answer. It's D. So that's probably going to be faster and safer for me than trying some other methods. So let's see if I can go down. Another good trick with math is to quickly eliminate anything that you know won't work. So when I look at this problem, one rule that we know is we have to be very careful not to have 0 in the denominator. And I look at this, we're looking for t, so I say, well, I can't have t minus 5. Oh, I keep forgetting to annotate. T minus 5 cannot be 0, so I know B is not going to be the right answer. So very quickly, I can increase my chances of getting this right. Okay. Here is another example that uses both elimination and plugging in. This is looking for the set of all positive integers that are divisible by both 15 and 35. And they want to know what is the least positive integer. So if I'm going to plug in answers, guess what? I'm going to start with the smallest thing. Well, I can eliminate 5 right off the bat because I know you can't do 5 divided by 15 or 5 divided by 35. So that one's gone. And in fact, it's pretty easy to tell that 50 can't be divided by 15 or 35. 105, well, I just pull out my calculator at this point and start calculating and find the answer. So that is an example again of using the answers. There are other ways to solve this problem, but they're just going to take longer. Okay, another wonderful technique on SAT and ACT math, especially if you have a problem that has any kind of ratio built in, is to just try real numbers, make up your own numbers and plug them in instead of using variables. So for example, in this problem, you've got Mary James and Carlos. They're selling advertisements for the yearbook. Mary sold twice as many as Carlos and James sold 3 times as many as Mary did. They love problems like this. So you could say M is the number of ads that Mary sold, and M equals 2C, and J equals 3M, and now I have a whole bunch of variables and I'm getting myself confused. How about we just assume that Carlos sold 1 ad, okay? And let's assume that that's Carlos. Okay, Mary sold twice as many, so Mary sold 2. And James sold 3 times as many as Mary, James sold 6. So I've got 1 plus 2 plus 6 is 9. That's how many we sold. And what is the question? What fraction of these advertisements did Carlos sell? Oh, Carlos sold 1, so it's 1 over 9. There you go. So use real numbers and make them easy numbers to work with, and that will be your friend. Okay, a couple more quick math tips. If you need to know what you're aiming at. And did you realize that if you are trying to get up to a 600 in SAT math, you actually only need to get 70% of the problems right. So you could skip the last 20% of the questions and just focus all your energy on the first bunch, give yourself more time, and that might be a really good technique for you. Now, if you're aiming to get a perfect 800 score, you can only get at most 1 problem wrong. So when you're drilling, you know you're working for getting 0 or 1 wrong on every practice test. And it's important for you to know. And this is another example of why you don't want to have those 2 students working together in the same prep group, because they're completely different approaches that they need to be working on. Obviously, with math, you need to make sure you know the basics. This is a good website on Prep Scholar to see basic formulas you need to know on the ACT. The ACT does not include formulas on the page. So you need to know what SOHCAHTOA stands for. You should know what is special about a 3-4-5 right triangle or a 30-60-90 right triangle, things like that. Sarah, you want to talk about the day of the test tips here?
Yeah, so first thing is to get enough sleep, and this means not just starting the night before, but starting 2 nights or even more before the test, so you get used to going to bed early and waking up early. Especially if you don't get enough sleep 2 days before something, that will affect you still 2 days later. Day of, when you wake up, make sure you have a good breakfast. I know often with nerves it can be hard to eat, but it is important to keep your energy levels up for a long time since the test does take a long part of the day. So eat a good breakfast. Make sure you've got protein, things like that, not too much sugar that will make you crash later. Bring extra batteries just for, if nothing else, peace of mind that you know if your batteries die, your calculator will still be usable. And all of the questions on the SAT and ACT can still be done without a calculator if worst case scenario happens, but just bring extra batteries anyway. Bring pencils. So bring a couple sharp ones and bring one that you have intentionally dulled to be fairly flat, because that's easier to fill in the bubbles quickly if you don't have just a little tiny point you're working with. Again, during the breaks of the test, walk around, even if I know a lot of people like to just sit there and do nothing during the breaks, but take the opportunity, leave the room, pace around in the hallway, at least stand up out of your chair, just get your blood moving so that it'll keep you alert and keep you focused. And no visiting with people. I know they say this the day of the test, but it really is true. Don't talk to people in the hallways about the test, because it's pretty easy to psych yourself out of things even if you did well. So just keep to yourself, keep things moving. And lastly, slow breathing. I know it sounds cheesy, but it really does help just to stay calm.
Yeah, if you start having a panic attack, breathing in, holding it for a couple seconds and blowing it out slowly can really physically calm down your body. Here's a bunch of test dates. We'll just have that on the screen if you need to pause it and see what the registration dates are. And these are several different resources. Again, just so you can see that all in one place. Sarah, do we want to take time to talk about reading, or have we pretty much hit our time for the day?
It looks like we're about out of time, so I guess we'll leave those for another time. But...
All right, and all that's left is to tell you, go for it, go study and do well. Thanks for coming. We really appreciate you being here.